Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video. We have spoken about Admiral Fisher already in the past, looking at his career, but we're now going to take another look over his career in a way, but rather than focusing on Fisher the man and what he was doing in terms of his rank advancement and who he was annoying this particular day of the week, we're going to look at particularly in focus on what he developed or encouraged to be developed technologically, because of course Fisher is, if you ask the average person on the street what's Admiral Fisher known for, if they know who he is at all, it's going to be dreadnought, battle cruisers, and maybe HMS Incomparable right towards the end. But as it turns out, there's an awful lot more to it than that. So in this part two of our look at Fisher, we have, of course, Matthew Wright returning. So we've got, as is traditional, we've got our 10 question points to discuss. So I suppose we'll start off with number one, the early technological leanings of Fisher. So where do you think he's starting to look at all this technology that he's playing with as officer in the Royal Navy and then going, but I could make that better?
Yeah, well, of course, Fisher was brought up through the second half of the 19th century. I mean, this is the period of the most whirlwind technical change that the Royal Navy had ever seen in its history. And I think arguably the most whirlwind period of technical change in the history of the world, because the Industrial Revolution, which had been going on for some time by then, was starting to producing some very, very complex, powerful, sophisticated weaponry. You were starting to get the use of iron armor. Iron gave way to steel, various forms of steel. You had your compound armor with your sweated together elements. They were beginning to understand metallurgy. The whole science of shipbuilding, and it was a science, became highly developed at that time, to the point where by the end of that century, William White was able to produce something like, I think it was about a 600-page treatise on the physics and nature of ship construction. I've got a copy kicking around here somewhere, but absolute period of change, and Fisher was totally in the middle of it. But more to the point, he was in the middle of it and had certain roles in the Admiralty through the 19th century and then into the 20th that put him in the driving seat. And, you know, it suited him very well. He was a technophile. A lot of the controversy that swirled around Fisher came because not everybody was a technophile. Many people viewed the technology as perhaps threatening to their habits and way of life, perhaps threatening because nobody knew how it would perform. They disagreed with the theoretical performance and so forth. Fisher was less cynical, and so it began to a large extent when he was in charge of, for example, the torpedo set up in HMS Excellent, the training school, which of 1872, I think, was the date when he started dealing with torpedoes. And at that time, they were going from spar torpedoes, they were going from, we would call them mines, so just floating torpedoes, to these newfangled automobile torpedoes, with which were only a few years in development at that point. And they offered a whole radical new way of dealing with naval combat. Nothing like that had particularly been used before, and certainly this automobile torpedo was seen as a wonder weapon. You ended up with different schools of thought coming out of it. The French Génicole school, by which a fleet of little ships with torpedoes could defeat the huge, expensive battleship fleets of Britain. So Fisher was right in the middle of this. You had Fisher was involved as captain of HMS Inflexible, which was the super high-tech battleship of the late 1870s. I think it was 1876, I think, laid down. Completed early 1880s, had an electrical system on board. I mean, who'd heard of electricity in 1878? kind of thing. So things, they were really pushing the edges of technology. He was surfing the wave of it. And one of the key commands that he got was when he became Director of Naval Ordnance in October 1886. And what this did was it put Fisher in the driving seat for a lot of gun development. He got to know quite intimately how guns were made, the performance of guns, how the performance could be improved. He dug into the metallurgy of it. There was a new type of 6-inch gun being developed, I think it was 40 caliber quickfire. He managed to get that put on board the battleships authorised in the 1889 Naval Defence Act, the Royal Sovereign class. At that time, of course, the 6-inch gun was considered to be as important a weapon as the heavy guns because of the ranges at which the battles were occurring. The hail of fire that you could get was considered to be pivotal. And so here was Fisher putting in these much faster firing, more effective 6-inch guns. Suddenly, so it was upping the power of these ships. And he had a fascination also with how to use these things tactically. And this developed into a fascination with speed and tactical speed on the water. What can you do with tactical speed? And of course, at this time, naval tactics were in a period of absolute uncertainty because there's all this new technology and nobody knew how to fight with it. They didn't know how the technology would perform. It had never really been done. There were odd battles like the Battle of Lisa, where they had ironclad clash, and these were poured over because they were the only examples. And so I think that was the one where they ended up deciding that rams were most important for ships, which a little bit off. Fisher was in the middle of this. So you get through into the 1890s, and he's had a huge influence already on the shape and nature of the technology, on the styles of ships that are being built. Before he becomes Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean, where he then proceeds to put into practice some of his ideas and thinking, gunnery in particular. And it was during that period that Reginald Bacon started revolutionising gunnery at Fisher's urging, improving the target shooting, basically, figuring out ways to use these guns. Fisher was right in the middle of that. So, and we haven't even got up the Dreadnought era yet, but it was all foundational to what then followed. And this immersion that Fisher had in the technology of the day and the techniques, the interplays that he had with the various naval constructors, all of whom he seemed to know, made a point of knowing them. So even while he was CNC in Mediterranean, he was thinking about, well, what are we going to do with all this technology that's coming up? How can we construct ships that will fight effectively? What are the effective ways of fighting them? He wasn't the only one thinking along these lines, of course, but he was the one that ended up mainly in the driving seat to an extent when he became First Sea Lord in 1904. So, that was Fisher's background to what was going on in that period. So he was incredibly well suited to understanding this full gamut of these new technologies, new thoughts. And he knew very well that they were essentially experimental, that they'd never been tried in battle. And there were limits to what you could do with target practice. There were limits to what you could do with shooting up old battleships, which they did do occasionally, because much older designs.
And then that brings us forward to the point where, something again that's maybe not always appreciated is in Nelson's time, you're engaging at 500 yards ish and decreasing. A cannon 32-pounder long gun can reach out 3 miles, but on a rolling wooden warship aiming by eye, you ain't hitting anything 3 miles away. Not certainly anything you're aiming at. Now, things have gotten slightly better, but not much,
Yeah.
because towards the end of the 19th century, you have, well, you've got the Spanish-American War right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And at that point, they start out with, for example, Battle of Manila Bay, they start out at what's considered exceptionally long range, 1,500 yards. Turns out they can't hit anything. And so you have this kind of Pac-Man, I like to call it the Pac-Man battle, because they're basically just back, reverse and slightly closer, reverse and slightly closer, gradually get until they're down to basically Nelsonian ranges, in the hundreds of yards before anything substantial, interesting starts happening. And people looking at this and going, but my gun could like reach to the horizon. So, and then you start seeing the development of first rangefinders and then subsequently fire control to make better use of the data that's coming out of the rangefinders. So where does Fisher slot into that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he was basically the guy behind it all and the revolution of fire control in the Royal Navy. I have a personal story. I had two great uncles in Royal Navy, First World War, and one of them was involved in fire control. And he was telling me all about it. I still remember as a kid. He was in his 80s by this point, and telling me about how it was done, and the strange gimcrack machinery that they had to do it with bicycle chains, dryer tables, and so forth. And Fisher was behind the whole revolution. It came out of the fascination with speed, and it came out of the fascination with the tactics. How do you fight these ships? What was discovered was that if you could control your guns properly, that is, if you could work out fall of shot and range and get all the calculations made correctly in the time you had to do it in, dealing with multiple moving targets all at once, then you could hit at much longer ranges with those guns. And they started working up ways of doing just that. So you had, they started off with the smaller caliber guns, and Bacon even built practice machines. I think it was called the Dotter and Spotter, by which they could practice shooting with the gun without actually shooting it, and get very good at being able to aim it. The heavier guns were more difficult. And we've got to realize that, at the time, turn of the 20th century, the battleship mix was that you had your two heavy guns, typically with British, it was 12-inch, to punch through the armor and to do a few heavy blows, but they recognized they wouldn't really hit that often. And at the time that, the loading rates were quite slow. You then had your battery of 6-inch guns that were considered, they wouldn't do critical damage, but they would do a lot of devastation. In effect, a mission kill. And the combination together was considered effective. But as you increased the range, that broke down because the 6-inch guns became less and less effective. So they started putting in intermediate weight guns. The Americans, in fact, were the first to do it. Fisher wasn't the only one in the world doing it. Everybody else was doing something similar, but he was leading the pack, surfing the wave of it. You ended up with an intermediate battery on these battleships. Because the range was increasing, you needed a heavier hit further away, and this provided it, supplementing, replacing the 6-inch. Where does that lead you, was the question. And these were the things Fisher was wrestling with when he was Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean. You've got all this capability of weaponry, you've got an increasing capability of fire control, where you've got starting to get better range finding systems at I'm trying to recall offhand when they got direct to fire, and I think it was 1900 and early 1900s, but not until just before First World War they got a proper system set up for the ships. However, they were getting range clocks, which you could sort of adjust so that you could calculate the rate of change of range. They were starting to get trigonometrical calculators that could adjust for where to point the guns. And there was a key change that was made 1903, 1904, and it was actually John Jellicoe that did it as controller. He was part of Fisher's group, part of what was known as the fish pond. And Jellicoe, as controller, ordered heavy gun mountings developed that could be loaded at any angle, that could track a target continuously, that could elevate against the roll of the ship. And this was a key thing, because it meant you could continuously hold the gun on target. And that they'd found was the key thing to fire control. So that's 1904, that was under development, the B Mark 8 gun. They called it gun hydraulic machinery. In fact, it was all the machinery, it was the handling room, it was the turntable, it was the armoured gun house, it was all the walking pipes that went to power the hydraulics. And they went through a bit of a teething phase with it. This was being developed as Fisher was developing ideas for a battleship that could fight at longer ranges effectively. And to him, that meant having all big guns, because the 6-inch were no good anymore. Your intermediate battery, there were two issues with it. It's often, in the literature, it's often put down as just one. There were two. One of them was indeed the fire control, but the more critical one was that in the design of the ship, having to make room for multiple calibers of ammunition and multiple magazines and multiple storage complicated the whole ordnance calculation, added weight, and increased the running costs. And Fisher was aware of all of these things. So you've got high efficiency of design and cost by going to a uniform main armament, for example. So all these factors were all coming together as he became First Sea Lord. He wasn't the only one thinking about this. There were, of course, we've had the Italian designer Cuniberti was thinking along those same lines. Offered, I think, 1903 James fighting ships, the ideal battleship for Britain. And it was I think 12-inch guns. The United States Navy had gone down its own line thinking that way, and they were developing same thing, an all big gun battleship. Japan was looking at very, very similar approaches. And the whole thing was driven by that increase in range, increase in ability to control your fire. So Fisher is there right in the middle of all of this, arrives as First Sea Lord. He's got his fish pond with him. He is absolutely brutal in his ability to crush opposition. And he's coming in more particularly as First Sea Lord with a mandate and requirement from Cabinet to cut the naval estimates. But he doesn't want to reduce the firepower of the Royal Navy. So his method for doing it was to come up with a ship that was of itself a little more expensive, but the running costs were very close to an existing battleship. The efficiencies that he could get from the all big gunship were huge in terms of the running cost, the weight allocated in the design to the armament, in terms of the different calibers of weaponry. It reduced the logistic issues, and it gained gun power at those ranges. So from his point of view, having an all big gun ship was a win-win situation from all these different factors that were coming into play at the time. And it brought Britain into line with trend. So there was Fisher's position, but it was a risky one. And it was quite a high risk, because until that point, Britain had typically allowed other people to lead and make the first mistake, and then used superior industrial capacity to leapfrog them. And you had that with the original ironclad, with the Gloire class. Britain didn't build one immediately. They let it sit for a little while, had a look, found out what the French were doing, and then leapfrogged it and built a radically better ship,
Mm.
the Warrior. And you can see that happening throughout the period, right up until you get the Dreadnought, at which point suddenly Britain's leading. And that was Fisher. And it was quite a risk. It was a change of policy, change of nature of what was being done. And to me, that suggests that his main motive was the financial side of things. He could get this pushed through. He knew that they would also only have a reduced number of warships that they could build. He needed to make each hull more efficient, more powerful, and this was how to do it. So, but there is a key point to that about where he was going with that whole line of thinking. That's the Dreadnought side of things.
Yeah. So I suppose winding the timeline a little bit back, obviously, as you said, Kiniberti was suggesting the all big gun design for a while, but we know, as you mentioned, Fisher was wrestling with a lot of issues related to gunnery when he was in the Mediterranean. And we know from his sketches, he was kind of thinking along similar lines in terms of having a uniform main battery quite a while before. We talked in the previous video how his chosen command was HMS Renown with 10-inch guns. And he designed a number of armored cruisers and battleships with uniform, either in the case of the cruisers 7.5 or in the case of battleships 10-inch main batteries of a type that, okay, given that this is obviously a little while in the sort of the late 19th, very early 20th centuries, some of the designs they have a lot of wing mounted guns in the style of the period. But it shows, I think, with those designs particularly, he appreciates the point of having a uniform main battery, perhaps long before everybody's decided that to implement that starting off, as it turns out, on a Dreadnought scale rather than where Fisher was starting on an armored cruiser scale. Yeah,
well, I mean, the thing too was the 10-inch. He had to be his first, even with the Committee on Designs of 1904-05, which he was the chair. He wasn't part of the committee. He was only the chair of it, which was the one that came up with the Dreadnought. Even then, he came in with 10-inch guns as his thought. We've got to remember at the time, we've got to think about the scale of these things. At the time, a 10-inch gun at the sort of ranges they thought they'd be fighting was a perfectly good gun. It would penetrate all known armor. And apparently he got persuaded that the 12-inch had a much greater hitting power, so he ran with that one. But the appeal for him with the 10-inch and also the 7.5s on the armored cruisers was the rate of fire. You could throw weight of metal with them that you couldn't with the bigger and heavier guns. And that appealed to him, this idea of smothering an enemy ship, which is a very Nelsonic way of thinking. I mean, that's very much, Trafalgar thinking. But it was going to work. I mean, there's stuff in his writing where he's talking about, he was envisaging a ship being hit 3 times a minute with 12-inch shells and saying, this is hell, this will be hell on board. You think 3 hits a minute, but then you think, well, okay, that's a pretty big gun relative to the size of ship and the construction of the day. And you've got all the shrapnel flying through bulkheads and all the rest of it. It really would be pretty nasty in those standards, yeah. But Fisher also had this enthusiasm for speed. I mean, that was the other side of the Dreadnought and of his armored cruisers, that he wanted everything to be faster. And it's kind of hard to tell whether he had in mind tactical flexibility or strategic, that he could have command ships to go places at very high speeds and get there faster than anybody else. But certainly tactically, again, how do you use these ships? If you've got the faster ship, you control the battle. You can control what the enemy fleet does, because you can always pull out of range if you need to and force them to do things. So that was the logical thinking. And you take that to its logical extreme. every ship that you have is faster than the enemy ships. Therefore, you have the superiority on the sea. In practice, of course, you could not build a fleet like that, because as soon as you build a fast ship, your likely enemy is going to match it or beat it. So you build a faster one again. So you still end up with a fleet of ships that's got all these different high speeds. And he knew that that would happen. But they were viewing armored cruisers as a means by which you could apply force on particular parts of the enemy battle line, as an example. And this was the origin of the battle cruiser.
Yeah, and of course, again, as we mentioned in the previous video, but this has a lot of bearing on the technical side of things, was that, you know, he's designing the fleet of the future in his head, and at the same time he's looking around at all these basically at this point ancient ships that were, you know, technically obsolete within a few years of their launch, but were probably still useful second line vessels. But now they're not even third or fourth line vessels. You have I think, what was it, HMS Warrior in the 1890s was still optimistically listed as a third class armored cruiser, despite the fact it had, you know, it had 4.5 inches of armor, but it was 4.5 inches of iron, which, you know, once you run that through the conversion from iron to compound to Harvey to Krupp, you know, by the 1900s, that's like the equivalent of like an inch, basically splinter proof. And they're still calling it an armored cruiser of some description. You know, I'm sure Scharnhorst was quaking in its boots at the thought of coming across some 68-pounder muzzle loaders or something. So he's also scrapping vast swathes of the old Navy in order to, well, free up crew and free up money to pay for this new stuff. And I think I also remember reading at some point that that sort of the speed issue, a lot of that, again, as you mentioned, he starts to see this with the armored cruisers even before Dreadnought's built. And I do remember reading that at one point his concepts on speed, at least at that point in terms of protection, come from the fact that the ability to track your opponent was actually relatively limited. You look at the rate of turn of the big guns and everything, and this all plays into the range finding system, because if you're expecting a battle range of 1,500, 2,000 yards, if your opponent can start running circles around you at 25 to 30 knots, you legitimately may not actually be able to hit it, because your guns, even if they can theoretically turn fast enough to keep up with it, they're going to be in a continuous turn, and the early fire control systems of the day can't handle your guns being in a turn, as well as the enemy. You've got to have your ship in a certain course and speed, and you know your enemy's course and speed, and you plug that in, and it says, right, the gun needs to be aimed here. But if by the time you communicated that to the turret, your guns had to go here and now here and now here, because the ship's going all over the place, then at that point, basically speed is armor, because it's providing you with a protection. But things are advancing so quickly, you know, at the time that Dreadnought's being built, people are, okay, their range has advanced somewhat to several thousand yards, but sometimes people forget that, you know, when Invincible and so forth are being built, the ranges are still, battle range is still considered to be sub 10,000 yards. By the time of World War One, they've gone up to almost 20,000 yards, and then it's just a matter of mathematics. You know, if you're going round in a circle at, like, say, 25 knots at 6,000 yards, your rate of change relative to your target, and therefore how fast they've got to track you, is going to be one set of values. But if you're doing exactly the same speed, but you're now going down, describing the radius of a circle at 15,000 yards, there's actually a very marginal change in the degree that the enemy gun has to point at you, and suddenly this principle no longer works. So I think that it's very important for people to remember when, you know, apart from anything, it wasn't the speed of the battle cruisers that was the problem at Jutland, but when people, you know, occasionally do rag on at Fisher about, oh, he thought speed was armor and Jutland proved otherwise, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, there was a dimensionality to his thinking as well, which is I've not seen it considered in most of the literature. Um, and his thoughts changed over time. Um, I mean, the thing with the battle cruiser was that it was developed as a dreadnought. They didn't even call it a battle cruiser for
Mm.
1911 before the term was
Yeah.
even. It was an armored cruiser, and it was a dreadnought armored cruiser. And the idea was that it was doing to the armored cruiser what the dreadnought did to the battleship. So you had an all-big gun armament on an armored cruiser. That was it.
Mm.
And again, Fisher went in with the idea of 10-inch guns on an armored cruiser, all uniform, got persuaded to up those to 12-inch. And apparently it was a very heated debate over that one because it kind of overgunned them. But that's where it ended up.
Mm.
But they were armored cruisers, and that was the thing. And we've got to remember at the time, of course, the armored cruiser had multiple roles. You had your commerce protection role. You had your role heading a cruiser force, for example, out in the Empire, for which you needed a ship with some reasonable punch. They were talking about using them. And in fact, of course, at Tsushima, which followed this committee, incidentally, it didn't influence them. The Japanese used their armored cruisers, in effect, in the battle line to bring pressure to bear. In the United States, you had they were looking at using armored cruisers with heavy gun armament in a heavy scouting role. And they developed that through the first years of the 20th century, that idea. So there were a whole lot of different roles coming up for these ships. There's been a huge amount of debate, and again, it's gone through phases. You've got Arthur Marder, of course, with the original analysis of Fisher and the position of the dreadnought, the position of the battlecruiser, and what Fisher was thinking. Marder's 1940s, 50s version of things was questioned by the subsequent generations. So you had historians like Lambert, for example, coming up questioning those earlier ideas and coming up with new ideas, new ways of looking, new questions to ask, in effect, to test against the evidence. With Fisher, he had an incredible volume of material that he wrote. He appeared to be loquacious, but really he kept a lot to himself. And the key questions like, what the hell was he thinking about battle cruisers? You can only answer inductively. And you can make an educated supposition, but really it's going to be a discussion, not some final conclusion. And it's possible that Fisher himself didn't know either. Again, everything was theoretical. He'd come up with what he thought would be a good answer, but you don't know. Technology kept changing. The ranges kept increasing. As you say, the ability to outstrip your enemy's potential to hit you by moving fast, it disappeared at longer ranges. So there is one thing, though, which was the 1905-106 committee that Fisher came up with. So this is an important part of the whole dreadnought battlecruiser story. And it's one that's been lost because, well, finances is the actual answer. But anyway, it's been lost because politics. 1904-05, Fisher comes in, sets up the Committee on Designs, and it's got all the top people in the fish pond in it. He's been including Jellicoe, who was really influential on the whole thing. It's got the Director of Naval Construction, Philip Watts, very talented guy, very well known for aggressively arming his ships. Come up with the dreadnought and the invincible design dreadnought armored cruiser. And we need to call it that. Watts was criticized for only putting 6 inches armor on the belt and so forth. And he said, well, I was told to armor it as an armored cruiser. So he did. And at the time, considering the ranges and the likely enemy it was up against, that was fine. Not a big issue. Following year, Fisher tried to rinse and repeat. And they had a second committee was formed. What are we going to build for the next year's program? And they came up with a whole new design, a ship that combined the firepower of Dreadnought with a somewhat different gun arrangement and the speed of the armored cruiser. And this was an ideal ship, in effect, a fast battleship. But we don't want to get hung up on nomenclature, because one of the things that seems to be forgotten, I keep seeing arguments and so forth in bulletin boards and in various books and articles, people get hung up on ship classification. At this time, ships were running out beyond what classifications could permit. They were whole new concepts that had to be somehow fitted into existing classifications. So you had your Dreadnought, which was a battleship. You had your Dreadnought armored cruiser, which they called an armored cruiser. And then there was this thing, the X4 design, 25, 26 knots. I think it was 12-inch guns they came up with, might have been 10. I'm just doing that off memory at the moment. Combining the best features as Fisher saw it of the previous year's designs. And they worked out that they could build 3 of them for the cost of 4 Dreadnoughts. So suddenly you had what to Fisher was this ideal ship. It had the armor and firepower of a battleship and the speed of a cruiser. And this was the ideal ship. 1906, and it got squashed. And the reason it got squashed was because it was going to cost more. They wouldn't have as many hulls, but more particularly, they'd already started the revolution with the Dreadnought, and they knew that they had obsoleted the older ships to an extent, not to the extent that you might consider, they still considered they had good fighting power for the day. But they didn't want to have a fleet that suddenly consisted of each new year made the last year obsolete ad infinitum. So they put a stop to it. The board wouldn't accept it. Cabinet wouldn't accept it. And so instead they built 3 repeat Dreadnoughts in that year's program. But it's an indication of where Fisher's thinking was going. And I mention this because, there's the old trope that Fisher invented thin-skinned battle cruisers that were then vulnerable to enemy fire, and had this idea of, speed as protection. But if we look at it dimensionally through time, as you say, speed is protection at shorter ranges. And that's what he was thinking early on. When you got out to the longer ranges, he was thinking armor, but he couldn't get that through politically. And he still liked the idea of higher speed ships. So for political reasons, he had to continue with these Dreadnought armored cruisers at that time. But there's a dimension to it. His mind kept working through, and this, so we can explain his later ideas in terms of that changing thinking. And when you get to the end of his period as First Sea Lord, he started looking at radically different ships. He got hung up on the idea of what he called oil engines. And he had diesel engines, basically. He had this idea that you'd build an internal combustion engined battleship, save the space for the boilers, and put torpedo boats in there with cranes, and you'd hook out these torpedo boats and go racing into battle with this diesel-powered battleship with this little fleet it had just launched of its own torpedo boats. And there's a whole description of it that I've got in his papers that he ended up ranting about in his autobiography of 1919, in this book, Memories. He had that idea. Then he got onto submarines. He decided submarines were the way to go. Came back into the Admiralty 1914, and there'd been a stopper put on further capital ship construction because, hey, the war wasn't going to last long. And they genuinely, didn't think it would. Fisher had other ideas about what he wanted. He thought the war would last long enough for him to get new ships built, as long as they were built quickly. The 1914 program had been cancelled. It included 3 modified Royal Sovereign class battleships. He had 2 of them redesigned off the orders as battle cruisers to his new concept. And this is a discontinuity. And this is something that hasn't been picked up, I think, enough in the literature and in, discussions on the bulletin boards and that sort of thing. You've got the original battle cruiser, a large armoured cruiser, basically, and that's all they were. When you look at the 13.5-inch battle cruisers, the Lion class, they actually had quite good armour. When you look at it, the armour increased 50% in thickness on the belt, for example. They were improving the extent of the armour. They weren't too bad. I mean, they could have been better protected. They weren't inadequate.
Well, when you look at Jutland, they stand up. The belt stands up perfectly fine against 11 and 12-inch gunfire. Queen Mary explodes, but Tiger doesn't. Princess Royal doesn't. Lion almost does, but that's nothing to do with the belt armor.
Yeah, exactly. It was fine, and it stood up. The area of it could maybe have been better. The ship's got a bit beaten up, but it was okay. 1914, although I must admit, you get on to the 1912 program, I'll just jump back a bit there. Fisher poked his nose into that one as the confidant of the First Lord Winston Churchill, and that was where they ended up with the Queen Elizabeth class battleships. They managed to persuade the fast battleship lobby. They got them. And but then, so again, Fisher with speed, wanting faster ships, but they also had to be armoured. Get on a few years to the modified R class, the Repulse and Renown, and suddenly all the armour's gone, basically. He's got back to the 6-inch belt. And then he has large light cruisers built, which was a sophistry to get around the ban on capital ships. Nonetheless, they were built as light cruisers with scantling. They had, I think, C-class cruiser machinery. I think it was doubled. I think was the way they did it. Throw on some 15-inch guns, and of course you've got a recipe to rip all the rivets, and as soon as the gun fires, and they did have to brace them up. They only got a 3-inch belt, and you got to wonder what the hell was going on there. All these ships were very, very fast, much faster than any other capital ship. They've been pushing to get up to 30 knots. Repulse and Renown were theoretically designed for, I think it was 32. Fisher was right into that. A whole change of thinking had gone on. What I think was happening was that he had now decided that with these new very heavy guns, the 15-inch, and then they had, of course, the 18-inch was in development, no armour could stand up to it. So why bother having it? And I think that's where he was going from the looks of it. So it's another new idea, but once again, speed is going to be protection, and this time you're going to have radically fast speed, radically big guns. And you can see this in some of his papers and his writings of the day, that these ideas were appearing for the first time. They extended his previous thinking, but he hadn't expressed them previously, not like this. And of course, then this ended up with the ultimate, which keeps coming up time and again, the ultimate paper design with the incomparable 20-inch guns, virtually no armour to speak of relative to the firepower. I think they were 35 knots. So so you can see where that thinking was going, and he went off down that track, and it was a whole new track. So we've got to look at the phases and the dimensionality of Fisher's thinking at that time. And as I say, it's something that has not come up in the literature, particularly to date. People got hung up on ideas about torpedo boat defences or the battle cruiser is not deconstructed in terms of its thought process with Fisher. You know, it's looked at as just a thing with thin armor, whereas in fact the whole process was a lot more complex, politicized, and from an engineering perspective, a lot more sophisticated than one would want, you know, than is normally given credit for.
In some ways, I kind of get the impression at times looking through his designs, especially once you move past Dreadnought and Invincible, that Fisher's concepts of what's going to be the next generation actually start very rapidly outpacing everybody else's capability to actually build things, because the concept of a ship with very large guns, very high speed, and actually relatively little protection, you know, okay, in the latter part of the 1910s, maybe turns out to be not quite so advisable. But when you move to the mid 1940s and you look at the very last generations of battleship design, so we're talking beyond Lion, beyond even Montana, when people are looking at like, what are we going to build as a potential battleship post World War II? A lot of those designs actually, to a certain extent, hark back to things like Renown, Repulse, and Incomparable, because they have the heavy firepower, they have the high speed. They're obviously silent anti-aircraft weaponry, which wasn't necessarily a thing in the 1918, but they've begun to radically sacrifice armor protection in favor of those things. And of course, those things don't get built because various weapons have come into play in the aircraft carrier. But it's interesting that kind of Fisher is in some ways 20-25 years ahead of everybody else in that form of thinking. It's just an interesting reflection on how quickly he was kind of thinking. I think he was the kind of person who thinks this is the next latest and greatest thing, I'll get that built, but he's already thinking as if he's playing both sides. He's thinking like, well, I've built this thing, but how would I counter this? And if if the enemy builds the counter to my thing, well, how do I build the counter to his thing? So let's build that counter before the enemy's even built their first counter. And you know, and to be honest, you know, the general principle of how he's designing his last few capital ships, whether the ones they built or the ones that, you know, are just exist on paper, he wasn't wrong. Because you look at what are warships these days? Lots of firepower, speed, basically no armor. It's like, apart from the fact that they don't, usually don't shake themselves apart when they launch a missile or whatever, a modern Type 45 or an Arleigh Burke has a lot more in common with the Courageous class than it does with any other gun-based capital ship of the day.
But it's that calculation. I mean, at the end of the day, the armor can only do so much. And if you look at like the last efforts to get the Lion class developed, I think they had the design X, I think it was. The DNC concluded that you could not armor the deck to any extent sufficiently to protect against the known bombs. That was it. So what's the point of wasting that displacement if it's no good? And Fisher had concluded that already with the guns. But this was a different calculation, as I say. That was the thing. It was a dynamic calculation, because that wasn't the case in 1904-05 when he developed the battle cruiser. Yes, his first battle cruisers definitely had to have armor, and to the extent of the armored cruiser, and that was adequate for the firepower of the day. But yeah, as soon as you started getting these much, much larger guns, more powerful in every way, and I guess too, if you look at the way that the British in particular went, the enthusiasm, you can see how the enthusiasms for armor protection, which, for example, the King George V class, 1936, had absolutely tremendous armor protection. They were really, really well protected relative to their size and displacement. Among the best armored battleships ever built in an absolute sense. And That was where British thinking had gone generally. So you can see that Fisher, and it was already going that direction after Jutland, the up-armoring of the hood, for example, as the first response. And then you've got the way that the thinking about armor then developed into the quite different system that was built into the G3s and the M3s, and then ultimately the Rodney, developed again for King George V. Fisher was absolutely out on a limb with his thinking when set against that juggernaut that was being developed. There's some interesting correspondence with the DNC of the day at 1916, DynCorps, and Jellicoe arguing over the armoring of the hood. But the whole focus on it is protection against shells. And at that point, they were still convinced that you could build armor to protect against 15-inch shells. And they were probably right. And in fact, it was quite effective. And certainly the later styles of armor, the all or nothing system that they then went to, worked against those shells, but it wasn't going to work against high level, high altitude, heavy bombing, for example, in the end, by the end of World War II. So eventually everybody came around to Fisher's thinking. But
Yeah. And
he was.
I suppose the another thing to illustrate that thinking is the indefatigable class, the repeat invincibles. Now, I'm obviously you've written a book about one of those ships. I'm incredibly critical of the design of Indefatigable. The weird thing is, like, even the people in question seem to realize this, because by the time they came around to build Australia and New Zealand, they'd actually slightly modified them. And once you lay it out, it's like, well, okay, what's Indefatigable? It's basically a lengthened Invincible, so you can get better cross-deck firing for P&Q turrets. But some genius just goes, well, you know what, we're going to keep the 6-inch belt the same length, so now the fore and aft turrets only have 4-inch belt armor, which, regardless of the fact that Germany's building von der Tann at that point, has now rendered it vulnerable to the very ships, armored cruisers and so forth, that it was supposed to be protected against. So they ramp up that protection a bit on Australia and New Zealand. But sometimes you look at that and go, well, they seem to be a bit of an anomaly, because they're actually worse protected than the Invincibles. And it happens on Fisher's watch. But what people sometimes don't necessarily appreciate is this isn't Fisher going, I want more speed, more firepower, and forget the armor on the Indefatigables. The design that he presents, that he actually wants to be built, is basically Lion 2 years early with the serial numbers shaved off. It's 13.5-inch guns. It's got significantly better protection. It's significantly faster. I mean, it's literally just rearranged the deck chairs a little bit, and it practically is HMS Lion. And then he's told no for budgetary reasons, and someone else goes away and comes up with, well, here's Invincible but worse, and somehow that gets through. I can only imagine what it would have been like to be a fly on the wall in Fisher's office that day.
He ended up, how can I put it, lying about the ship. I think that's the best way of describing it. He was openly lying about it, because among other things, he was trying to claim that they were motor ships, that they had diesel engines that would propel them incredibly fast, and this sort of thing. It was facile what he was doing. Although it was Fisher that caused HMS New Zealand and HMAS Australia to be that class. Because any battle cruiser was better than no battle cruiser kind of thing. And they were going to fight in the Pacific, in the China Station.
And as they on those two, they did actually uprate the armor over the magazines by a little bit. So someone had obviously looked at Indefatigable specs and gone, no.
That really was bad. What happened also, the later pair, the armor was actually better quality armor as well. That Gillicoated that. He had the Vickers process armor was used, not the earlier Krupp.
Mm.
There was just that slight improvement, sort of qualitatively. Yeah, no, from Fisher's point of view, I mean, that was the thing. The funding of it all was a key issue and a key problem that he was confronting right throughout. And he was dealing with a very conservative, well, it wasn't a conservative government, but they were conservatively spending.
Mm.
The guns versus butter problem, they were going for butter every time. And, it really rankled with him because he really wanted the most powerful navy that you could possibly build under any circumstance for, as we've been discussing, for deterrent purpose. And you weren't going to get it if you were penny pinching. So
Yeah.
the thing. And that also explains some of the drive he had to get the most powerful possible ships that he could get, which sometimes worked, but not often.
Yeah. Yeah. It's he kind of strikes me in some ways as someone who, when it comes to technology, he starts this run up, as we've been discussing. He starts this kind of run up probably really when he can influence things at the turn of the century, and he hits his kind of stride in the latter part of the 1900s, where he started from regular Navy officer. He's blown straight through all the technological progression. He's now on the cutting edge of everything. And then as you get into the 1910s, he's just accelerating away from everybody else. And he's like, this is the ship of 20 years in the future, but it's only going to be useful for 10 years. And then we're going to have to build this other ship. And he's constructed this entire timeline. I think by the time he gets around to Incomparable, he's basically saying, well, this is what we need now, but they'll be gone in 5 years, and then we'll need this, and then also submarines will then take over. Which again, he's actually right about. Submarines. Submarines are the ultimate arbiters of things nowadays.
Yeah.
Albeit he couldn't foresee nuclear weapons. Given this Fisher, he was probably imagining something along those lines.
Well, I don't know. Actually, there's a funny thing that I'm just reading. In fact, today the description he had of the giant motor ship carrying torpedo boat battleship that he wanted. He didn't think that he could get what he called a oil-fired turbine. He liked steam turbines, he liked motor ships, but he didn't think you could mix the two technologies. And I suppose he was right in terms of, thinking about reciprocating engines, thinking about how those work, and then thinking about how could you burn that in a turbine kind of thing. But of course, we have them today.
Yeah.
And no, he certainly didn't think of nuclear power, although weirdly, he worked with the guy that split the atom. The committee on ASDIC had Rutherford was one of the key scientists, and so Fisher and Rutherford knew each other, which is I've always thought quite intriguing. Fellow New Zealander and all that. Yeah. But yeah, they didn't envisage nuclear power at all, and what you could do with it. So hence of course the K-class submarine. General disaster in terms of what they were. You really couldn't do that with steam.
No. I just it's just he's a fascinating character generally, but I just also find, as we were kind of discussing in the previous video as well, the arc of his life, which pretty much is also the arc of his professional life, considering how early he started in the Navy. I don't think there's any other officer when it comes especially to capital ships where his entire professional career and technological development arc sits so beautifully in that he starts his life on an age of sail ship with muzzle loading cannons. He's there for the entirety of the ironclad developmental period. He's there as the ironclad turns into the pre-dreadnought. He drives the pre-dreadnought turning into the dreadnought, then the super dreadnought. And basically, at the point that he dies in 1920, there's basically only effectively only one more generation of battleships to go, because at the point when he dies, although the Washington Treaty hasn't quite come about and people are designing G3s, N3s, Lexington, South Dakotas, etc., those aren't actually going to end up being built. So the ships that he kind of sees out his life being constructed, Hood, the QEs, the Rs, etc., there's basically just the treaty and the treaty breaker ships in the late 30s, and that's it as far as the
Yeah,
development of the gun capital ship is concerned. And so he bestrides most of this period, and he helps develop and guide most of it as well.
yeah,
It's just, yeah, it's something you sometimes you don't really realize until you've looked at the whole arc of things and think, actually, that, you know, there was a guy who was there for everything. um and I mean, it's a slight tangent, but it kind of, in some ways, it harkens back to some thoughts I was having a few weeks ago, in that, you know, obviously we had the Queen's funeral, and I was looking at that and going, well, you know, the last time we had a monarch being buried in the UK, having a state funeral like that, that monarch had fought at the Battle of Jutland.
yeah,
um, and
yeah,
you know, the Queen was born in the 20s. There's a few years, there's a few years difference between them, between Fisher dying and the Queen being born. But then you look at the arc of history and you realize, especially from a naval perspective, as we said in the first video, Fisher entered Navy service when there were people who had been at Trafalgar, not only still alive, a couple of them, a little bit superannuated, were still in actual Navy service.
yeah,
Like, there were veterans of Jutland, of Trafalgar, fighting in the Crimean War. Um, and his life obviously overlaps the life of King George VI, who was the Jutland veteran who we just mentioned. So it's just this slightly bizarre thing that here we are sitting in 2022, and up until a few months ago, we were actually only 3 degrees of separation from Trafalgar through some
yeah.
people.
It's absolutely astonishing, you know, when you think, but that's the reality of it. I mean, you know, we look at history in a very compressed way, in the sense that the more recent periods become more detailed for us, and yet they're also very close, and this really
Mm.
underscores that. Um, and you know, even further back, going back, you know, 200
Mm.
years to Trafalgar, it's actually quite close, you
Yeah.
know, in that sense. Um, and that's an astonishing way of thinking, because as we've been discussing with Fisher, you span that period. We've gone from wooden walls, we've gone, you know, the cannons, the smoothbore muzzle loading cannons, the age of sail, through the whole, not just technology, but multiple generations of technology. Get up to the end of Fisher's life in 1920. I mean, you know, they had wireless radio, they had the beginnings of the technological, the second industrial revolution was well rolling by that point. You're starting to get into you know, the age of flight um, is already dawning upon the world. And Fisher's life spanned that. And he was a technophile. He loved all that technology and absolutely embraced absolutely all
Mm.
the technology he could get at. You can only speculate as to what would have happened if somebody of his nature had followed in, you know, through into the Second World War.
Yeah.
Although his legacy did, I mean, he really did shape the Royal Navy,
Mm.
and his legacy really did have a high effect. I mean, that technical side of things continued absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, well, there you go, everyone. Admiral Fisher, the man, the officer, and the technocrat. It's certainly has left a huge legacy. And I mean, well, it's the first time I've covered a naval officer's biography, and we basically had to put it across 2 whole videos. So I think the only one who's got anything longer than that is Nelson, and to be fair, that's mostly because Trafalgar takes up 2 videos on its own. um But yeah, of course, which is the slight irony of Fisher is such a dominant character, and yet after the bombardment of Alexandria, he's not actually involved in leading any major battles. Although some small part of me, much as a better admiral for the battle cruiser fleet than Beatty is probably not the highest of bars to clear. Some small part of me just kind of wonders what would have happened at Jutland if someone had, gone and got over and dragged Fisher out of wherever he was hiding at that point and gone, right, but for reasons unexplained, but possibly to do with time travelers from the future, we're going to put you in command of Lion instead and just let him cut loose at the Germans.
Would have been an interesting battle. His innate caution, the extraordinary caution that he actually directed the war at strategic level. Would that translate to his tactical?
Yeah.
I certainly don't think he'd have made the mistakes Beatty made.
No.
Yeah, but you never know.
You never know. So unanswered questions for alternate histories. But so there we go. So anyway, thank you very much once again for showing up and recording this video with me. Those of you who have enjoyed this, obviously there's so much more to Admiral Fisher than we can cover in 2 videos. There'll be some links below to various articles on what Admiral Fisher did during his career that our guest here has written. And of course, you've got the book on HMS New Zealand. Anything else you'd like to promote for people to pick up?
Well, I mean, there's the book on HMS New Zealand, which is still very much in print and it's been very well reviewed. So yes, I've got a lot more indeed about Fisher in that, because he was, as I've showed there, instrumental in why HMS New Zealand was built as a modified Indefatigable. And his story pokes into the story of HMS New Zealand fairly thoroughly. So I'd certainly recommend everyone to buy and read the book. And I have other books in print and so forth. They tend to be of more direct New Zealand interest, but I have a website, and please come and have a look at it.
Yeah, well, links to all of that in the video description below, and we'll see you all at some point in another video. Bye, everyone.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.